Ymedia.
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 Stay tuned with Ymedia.
Ymedia is a media company. With 360-degree approach.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and there is a lot to talk about today. Well, it's been stated by the Prime Minister, Canada is at war with the United States. Not the typical war that you think about when it comes to missiles and fighting. They're still fighting, but this is a war on tariffs, the economy, and a war on words. And now it's even extended to the Vice President. It's extended to the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. And we're going to cover all of that in much detail. But what we're going to talk about today is essentially Canada announced its retaliatory tariffs towards the United States, as well as what's taken place with the collapse of the negotiations, the 50% tariffs that the Americans have put on Canadian products, and what this means for the consumer and for businesses. So there's lots to talk about, and of course the fallout when it comes to how all the different provinces are reacting to this, and even on the state side. So, well, we talked about it in quite detail yesterday when Canadians woke up on Saturday morning. Well, they saw that there's tariffs. Tariffs were placed by the United States on Canadian goods of the exports that go to the United States. And then we saw the press conference from Prime Minister Mark Carney essentially announcing what's taking place, and that Canada was attacked, and therefore there's going to be a response. So today, the Prime Minister announced his response from Ottawa to the Americans, and in this case, more specifically, President Trump, in terms of what is going to take place when it comes to tariffs on American goods that are imported into Canada. So now Ottawa said that they're going to impose the counter tariffs on more than 700 American products, and that's supposed to begin on September 8th at midnight. Now, this is an escalating the trade conflict that, essentially followed the collapse that took place on Saturday. And if you recall, the initial deadline was on August 19th that the 50% tariffs on Canadian goods will apply. And then it was pushed out for 3 days. And in that time period, the president said, hey, there's going to be a deal. There was very positive things the president said. The prime minister was a little bit more careful on his terms. And we even discussed, what's going to be reduced from the 50% tariff when it comes to quotas. It's going to be reduced to 25% when it came to steel, aluminum, until the quotas hit. And after the quota, it's the 50% tariff. So we got some details out of the negotiations that were taking place for days on end. And then last minute, things changed, everything fell apart, and the prime minister said it's just the deal could not be done. And then also there were questions on, was it Howard Lutnick that came in last minute that changed things up, when it was, of course, the lead negotiator was Jameson Greer. And the prime minister did not answer to it, but did respond by saying the Canadian team was all on the same page, the Americans not so much. So in an indirect way saying, yes, something did torpedo the negotiations that essentially led to the collapse. Now, what's taking place now is that Canada has now announced their retaliatory tariffs, and the targeted products will face Canadian duties of 25 to or 50%. And this is a time where also Ottawa's launching a $7.5 billion assistance package for the affected workers and businesses. So this is very significant, the announcements that are made today. So the value targeted on U.S. imports is going to be, that's going to have the tariffs, is going to be about $27.6 billion. So it's it's dollar per dollar pretty much. And it is the 700 categories that we'll go into some detail on. And so essentially this tariff is from 25% or 50%, which is a smaller number that will face another 15%. So it breaks it down. And the industries that are targeted, now these are the American industries that will be targeted for tariffs when they import their goods into Canada. And we're looking at metals, seafood, clothing, household appliance, and electronic devices. And so this is a time where the Parliament, Ottawa is saying there's going to be easier access to employment insurance to be able to have worker support with this $7.5 billion package to support these Canadian industries. And when it comes to business support, it's also an expanded loan and financing programs that was announced today. So now Ottawa describes this response as what they're saying in quotes is a dollar for dollar and rate for rate. So now what are some of these 700 products that will have duties, tariffs placed on it that will be coming from the United States? Well, on that list is makeup, smartphones, appliances that are targeted by Canada's counter tariff measures, right? So if you want to break it down in terms of what it is, well, we're talking about $27.6 billion worth of American made products, and the tariff will begin at 12:01 a.m. on September 8th. Now, this list is quite deep when it comes to reaching into consumer shopping baskets because it's covering selected smartphones, cosmetics, appliances, clothing, furniture, seafood, and dairy products, along with industrial metal, as well as tools and farm equipment. This measures will apply according to the products of the country of origin. So just not simply where the brand is headquartered or where the item was purchased. That's very important. And so when it comes to smartphones, it'll be the ones that are originating in the United States. So they're listed at about 50% tariff. Appliances, those are generally included in the 25% group when it comes to tariffs. And then steel and selected aluminum, furniture and apparel, they will be generally subject to about a 50% tariff. When it comes to cheese, seafood, and selected metal derivatives, it's also generally subject to about 25% tariff. So there's a breakdown of the 50%, 25%, and then 15%. The 15% are some electronics and tools that will be subject to 15% tariff, although individual electronics, including smartphones, are going to have the 50% tariff that are going to be placed on it. So now goods that are already traveling to Canada when the measures begin are exempt. So this is of course prior to the September 8th deadline, which gives Canadians and Americans about 2 weeks. And the existing Canadian counter tariffs on American automobiles will remain in effect. So now this is quite significant. Now, if you want to know more detail, like an item by item, definitely go to Canada.ca, and on there you'll be able to see item by item. It is a page. I can tell you exactly what it is. If you go to Canada.ca /EN for English /department finance news, if you just look that up, you will be able to see every item. It's stated how much tariff it's going to be placed on it. I just gave the round figures on the exact tariff amounts, but on just generally the industry. But if you want to go line by line of which includes under what, I would highly advise to go on to that, to see how your business will be affected if you are importing American goods that fall under those criterias of the smartphones that are originating in the United States, wireless communications and networking equipment, of course, men and women's apparel that will be added, whether it's coats, suits, jackets, trousers. If you are importing apparel from the United States and it originates in the United States, then they'll be subject to that. And then, of course, there's furniture, steel wire, pipes, tubing, structural products. So you want to go into all those details. Of course, there's no better place to look at it than the government's website, the Canada.ca, to see how this is going to be impacting you. Because when it comes to like the 25% tariff categories on appliances, we're talking about fridges, stove, and other kitchen appliances, gas cooking equipment, barbecues. So it's a quite extensive detail when it comes to also like cutlery, table utensils. Yeah, so this is important. And also when it comes to agriculture machinery or components, And that's where you have the mixed amount of the 50%, 25%, and the 15% tariff. Yeah, and this is going to be significant, right? Because these tariffs are being applied to everyday products. So it's not just industry like steel and aluminum. This is everyday products like makeup and cosmetics. So this will affect women who are purchasing American-made makeup and cosmetics that will apply, or for example, toilet paper. Families purchasing toilet paper or other paper products. This can impact clothing, footwear, and household electronics. So it adds up, right? Also, video game hardware as well as personal care products, and those are all itemized in there. So now the tariff that's charged to the Canadian importers, they're going to be paying it. The tariffs that are going to be placed on September 8th, and then it's based on the importer, so the business that's importing from the United States in those categories, if they're going to be passing the full cost to the shoppers. 50% tariff is very significant. It increases the rate of a product by 50%, right? Or 25% or 15%, or the importer may pass along only parts of the cost to the consumer, or maybe they might accept a lower profit margin and that's only if there's enough margin, right? So if you're selling a product, if you're importing a product and you're paying a 50% tariff on it, and let's say your margin's 70%, and yeah, you could potentially, swallow portions of that or even the whole tariff. But if you're selling things with very slim margin, like a 10% margin or 15% margin on the item that you're importing into Canada from the United States that fall under those categories, then you really don't have the ability of swallowing that cost if it's a 50% or 25% even, right? You're going to be at a net loss. So that means that you'd pass on some of those costs uh, to the customer, and a business must make margin because there's a difference between a business and a non-for-profit organization, right? A business is for profit, and so this really makes a big difference on Canadian businesses that will be importing, and not to mention the Canadian businesses that already export to the United States, and they have their 50% tariffs that have been added on by the Americans. So this affects both sides, and essentially, you may wonder why would Prime Minister Mark Carney choose 700 categories, and out of that, it's a lot of day-to-day items that you would purchase. And so some of the logic there could be that, it's Ottawa's push to make the consumer, you and I, switch to Canadian suppliers. So for example, if I'm purchasing American apparel where this tariff is added on, then I would then switch to a Canadian apparel provider. And essentially, if what's made in Canada, let's just say made in Canada is a little bit more expensive than made in America, for example, well, then the tariffs that will be placed on the made in America products are going to make it more expensive to purchase than compared to the made in Canada, or maybe equal to. So there's a push here that is quite evident from Ottawa to make Canadians change their shopping behavior, right? And then if you do this for a little bit of time, like Canadians are not purchasing American alcohol, for example, right? And when you have that the case, you get used to it, right? There's no like protests where Canadians are demanding those products. And so perhaps maybe this is going to be a way to change the behavior of Canadians to rely more on Canadian made products. And then therefore you have a situation where it's a Canadian producer selling to a Canadian consumer, no longer focused on export, right? Largest customer is the United States for Canadian exports. And so now with the interprovincial trade barriers removed, and a lot easier to be able to trade within Canada, then that is what appears to be Ottawa's goal. And importing the products, and also there's that difference of, okay, well, there's Canadian made suppliers and products, and then also the imports from other countries. Importing those products from another country may be of advantage compared to buying American made products that are now really expensive when these tariffs kick in. And then there's also criteria of applying for exceptional tariff relief that Ottawa is making a case for that. You could do that, but it's not automatic. There has to be a case. So now, what does this mean? Giving you an example, a product with a wholesale customs value of, let's just say, $1,000, right? When I say wholesale, that's the cost of the Canadian business purchasing the American goods, right? They purchase at a wholesale price and then they would add their margin on it to have the retail price to the consumer, you and I. So in an example where you have a product that, on wholesale cost a value of $1,000, a customs value because it's an import. And then if you have a 25% tariff, that creates your product at the $250 border charge, right? So that adds up. And then, so now your $1,000 is the value of the goods, the customs goods, and then the 25% is $250 on that $1,000. So now you're sitting at $1,250. And then when it comes to retail, right, what you're going to sell to the customer, the markups that you're going to have, then the transportation cost. Gas is expensive. There is a conflict with Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz is closed, which has 20% of the world's oil supply. Ontario doesn't consume Alberta oil. So, you're going to have higher transportation costs because gas prices are high. And if you recall, there was a 10% gas excise tax, sorry, 10 cents, not 10%, 10 cents on that was the gas excise tax that was removed temporarily until Labor Day, which is not too far away. Labor Day is a day before these tariffs kick in, so we'll see if the Prime Minister extends, removing the gas excise tax, which is about 10 cents on the liter for gas. And so when you have transportation costs on this now, $1,000 came in wholesale rate, custom duties, $250, so that's 1,250. And then you have, the markup for what the consumer will pay, which is the retail price. And then you have, you got to take into consideration transportation costs. You got to take into consideration exchange rates as well as sales tax. And that will determine what is the final shelf price, which is to you and I, the final retail price. And so that immediately becomes a lot more expensive when you start adding all those items in, right? The retail rate, like the retail markup rate that a wholesaler puts in, they're taking into consideration obviously their business, right? So they have rent to pay, right? Or a mortgage to pay on their facility, their business facility. They have employees to pay for. They have, costs, just operating the business. And then you also have to have margin on that, right? So the business is profitable. So that is the retail markup. And then you have the transportation costs, the exchange rates, right, between USD, CAD, United US currency, Canadian currency, as well as sales tax that gets applied on it. So then you have what this price will be for the customer. So you and I will go to the store and we'll see, a product that we purchased because what's been targeted on the 700 categories are day-to-day items. So we know what they cost on average, right? If it's, a self-care product, for example, you know what it costs. And so now all of a sudden you see a markup on it where it becomes more expensive, then perhaps on that same aisle, you're going to look at maybe some Canadian made products. And then you're going to see the price difference. And you're going to also think in the back of your mind, hey, I want to support Canadian businesses. Because when I support Canadian businesses, I'm supporting Canadian workers. I'm supporting people being employed, right? So that's going to be what's going to be in the back of our minds. And you do that for 1 week, 1 month, and many more months. And maybe it's just a thing. You start developing a relationship. This product works really well. Like usually if we find something works really well, uh, if it's goods that we purchase frequently, then we're likely to just keep purchasing that because it works for us, right? The product works for us. And then in the back of your mind, you're also thinking, you know what? I don't mind paying a little bit more as long as I'm supporting a Canadian business, right? And that's what we're looking at of what is to come in the coming weeks. And so the rationale there is, you have brands that will be nationally recognizable in terms of its Canadian made. But when it comes to a U.S. brand, it's not automatically subject to the tariff, right? So that's the important thing. What the tariff will apply to is the country of origin, and that depends on where the product was manufactured or substantially transformed. So again, it doesn't mean like if there's an office in the United States and therefore that brand is going to have the tariff. It's about if the product was manufactured or substantially transformed in the United States, and that would carry the burden of the country of origin. So, for example, an American brand smartphone, right, assembled in China may not be treated as a US origin, or a Canadian brand appliance manufactured in an American factory may be tariffed. So do you get what I'm saying here? So for example, if iPhone is an American brand, right? Because it's Apple. Apple is an American company. If their smartphone, like the iPhone, is assembled in China, then it may not get a tariff because the country of origin is China in terms of where it was manufactured, even though there's a head office in California, right? And it's an American company. And then vice versa, you also have a Canadian brand appliance, which is a Canadian company, but let's just say they're manufacturing their goods in American factories, not Canadian factories, and so therefore that may be tariffed. So a product that's shipped from a US warehouse but manufactured elsewhere may escape the surtax if it does not legally originate in the United States, right? So, in this case of the iPhone, let's just say it gets manufactured in China, then it gets shipped to a US warehouse, and from the US warehouse, then it gets shipped to Canada. Therefore, because it was not manufactured in the United States, it was just held in a warehouse in the United States, and the business address of the company headquarters or the corporate offices are in the US. It does not necessarily mean that specific iPhone. And I'm just giving you an example. I'm not saying for specifics, like, but that specific phone is now can escape the surcharge that Canada will place. So it has to be a cell phone that is manufactured in the United States, and a product that's assembled from components made in several countries may require a detailed custom determination, right? So, perfect example is the auto sector, where you have an automobile, you have an American vehicle, but parts of that was made in Ontario, parts of that was made in Mexico, parts of that was made in the United States. So therefore, that's an example of, this product was assembled from components, right? If it's a vehicle, whether it's the door or whether it's a dashboard, in several different countries in the auto sector, which is a very integrated manufacturing industry, is a perfect example of that. So this means that the tariffs will affect could vary among different models sold from the same company, right? So in this case, if it's a vehicle where it's like, let's just say Ford, right, has a vehicle that's been assembled in multiple countries, the components of it, then that is something that is going to be up for a challenge with the customs to show the components are not all made assembled in the United States. But let's just say another vehicle made from Ford is majority of it is assembled in the United States. And these are just examples I'm giving just to be able to know that it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray involved in how this is going to apply. And then you could have tariffs on one model and not on another model, which is something that for a customer, we're going to look to the sales representative to explain to us what's what, or for us to be able to read if there's proper indication on the products, right? If it's on a shelf versus a vehicle. So now why Ottawa selected everyday products is what we're wondering, right? About what's the logic behind that. And so now the government is saying that the objective is not to generate tariff revenue, because that's your first assumption. If you're going to just put tariffs on everyday products that that Canadians consume, then are you just looking for tariff money, right? And the government has said that no, essentially they want to reduce Canadian demands for American imports. They want to give Canadian producers a competitive advantage, which we did talked about the price for price. And then they also want to match Washington's dollar for dollar and rate for rate as a retaliatory tariffs to President Trump's 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. And they also want to pressure politically influential US industries. So they can call their president and they can call their governor, they can call their senator and business associations and really talk to them and plead on behalf of their industries. And then, of course, that will be an effort that will go straight to the White House. And we know President Trump likes to be popular with the markets. He likes to be popular with the business industries. And he enjoys when he sees the stock markets doing well and business in America is thriving, having a business background himself. So that's going to be part of the pressure. And then, of course, it's Ottawa said is to encourage American companies to lobby the White House. That's more specifically part of the reason, as well as to demonstrate that Canada will not absorb the US tariffs without responding. So really, Canada is doing right now, we're seeing Mark Carney do, if you recall, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did as his last thing before he stepped down when he introduced the dollar for dollar retaliatory tariffs. And that was in the very beginning of President Trump's second term. And that was the very end of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's time in office. And if you recall, even though Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's numbers in the polls were not doing so well, it picked up when he responded that way, if you recall. So we're seeing that take place right now in a way for Canada to step up to the United States. And it's also showing other countries how to perhaps deal with President Trump. Uh, Early on when the tariffs were announced on a big list of countries, if you recall, on the White House lawn, it was the United Kingdom that essentially, back then, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, did a deal with the United States, led with flattery, went to the Oval Office, and they looked like they got along quite well. And they were able to be the first country to deal with just 10% tariffs. And then really, then the King Charles stepped it up, gave President Trump a great state visit and opened up, the royal hospitality, which is really what President Trump wanted. And then that signaled to the rest of the world that if you lead with compliments, if you lead with, having that approach to the president of complimenting him and, and all of that and going along to get along, and that could potentially get you better rates for tariffs for, countries that want to access the US market. The US market's the largest market. Every business, every country wants to be doing business in the United States. It's the world's greatest GDP. It's the biggest market to enter. So therefore, when you have tariffs to enter that market, it makes you not competitive, and therefore you're not really relevant in that US market. So that essentially gave a signal that this is how to deal with President Trump, flattery, go along to get along. And then they saw it doesn't really work, right? You do that, and then things sound good for 5 minutes, and then next week, or even, in a few hours, you'll have a tariff, you'll have an announcement. And so now Canada is showing a way where under Prime Minister Mark Carney, he's leading the way on standing up to President Trump. And if you recall that announcement he made, that speech at Davos, right, about middle power and teaming together. And so now this is quite an example. And it could be determined if you really think about it, that maybe what worked in the United Kingdom was only particular to the United Kingdom because we know the president loves the royal family and he got the royal treatment by King Charles. And prior to that, if you recall, in his first term, he was smitten by the Queen. And so maybe that was a way that, you lead with flattery, you get a good deal, you give him a nice state visit, he loves the royal family, and that is that. That doesn't necessarily apply to the other countries where there's no affinity for the royal family, right? In those other countries where there is no royal family and there's no connection, and so therefore, leading with flattery hasn't necessarily worked. And this is something that Prime Minister Mark Carney is doing and leading the way, in terms of now doing counter for counter and saying, yeah, we got attacked and therefore we're in war. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll go into more detail about what these tariffs mean for Canadians and Americans.